Welcome to the Future of Work, a new series where we're trying to figure out what can be done now to ensure that all independent workers thrive in the years ahead. It's a new project that's done in partnership with Intuit underwrites the series. I'm Pete Leiden. I'm the founder of Reinvent. The company is actually driving the series, and I'll be kind of having the conversations, particularly today, with Nathan Schneider. He is a scholar in residence at the University of Colorado Boulder, coming in with us from Colorado here. And among other things, what he's done is he was launched or helped co-found and launch a very interesting conference in 2015 called Platform Cooperatism, and it's actually going to have another one here coming up in November of 2017. Out of that, it really explored the whole idea of a different way to kind of work on platforms, essentially the kind of tech platforms that are burgeoning all over the internet now. And they had a book that came out of there, which I think is right on point on some of what we're going to be talking about here, which is it's called Ours to Hack and to Own, The Rise of Platform Cooperatism, A New Vision for the Future of Work and a Fair Internet. So welcome. Good to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Let's start with the kind of, for people that, before we get into platform cooperatism, I just want to kind of get your hit on what is your analysis, you could say, of the current state of kind of tech platforms and how they influence, in our case, the future of work. So we can kind of talk about platform cooperatives in the context of what are they trying to solve. So give us a little sense of, in your analysis, what's going on right now with all these platforms.
Well, we're entering a phase, I think, or we've entered one, where the internet is no longer this nice toy that some people play with sometimes. Right? It is increasingly the kind of basic utility that our economy depends on, or a series of utilities that our economy depends on. And that requires a bit of a shift for how we think about how the internet works, how it's governed, and how it's owned. And in the realm of work, this means a couple of things. On the one hand, more and more people are finding their employment through online platforms, through the connections that online platforms enable. That could mean finding a job, just being connected with an employer through these things, or also actually working on these platforms, doing your work through them, like the very visible Uber drivers and these sorts of things, but also a great deal of invisible workplaces that we don't see quite so often, where people are gaining their livelihoods on online platforms. And that means that these platforms, again, are not just a choice that people may or may not opt into, but are actually becoming tools and mechanisms and markets that people depend upon. Then there's another side of it too, which is that for a lot of users, people who are interacting with online platforms, whether or not they feel they really want to. I mean, I think increasingly people don't really have a choice about whether to use tools like Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter because of expectations in the culture and the economy. They too are becoming a kind of worker. These are platforms which don't generate a lot of content for themselves. They rely on the rest of us to generate their content. And so even when we think we may just be talking with friends or sharing ideas or commenting on something or making art, we are in fact working in the sense that we are producing value that the shareholders of these companies are benefiting from. So these are a couple of the ways in which in this new moment of online platforms, we're seeing work being reconfigured, and it means it's time for us to ask much more serious questions about the governance and ownership of the platforms that we're relying on.
When you say this new moment, can you just put it a little bit of a context? Is the last decade we're talking here, the last 5 years? I mean, is there any kind of, how would you situate this development in your own way of thinking?
Well, I think it depends where you are, who you are. The future arrives at different times for different people and in different ways. I just had a guest in my class yesterday talking about online platforms that are totally accessible just through audio and phones, that are targeted at non-literate rural people in Pakistan. That's a very different kind of experience than the average Facebook user in the United States. Nevertheless, however we're experiencing these things, they're affecting us. In my own work, this became quite clear in the wake of the global financial crisis, right? After 2008, as a reporter, I started to see that crisis required a lot of people to kind of reconfigure their economic lives. And as they did, they were turning toward online platforms. My last book was about Occupy Wall Street, so it was focused on people who were trying to look toward what a future economy might look like, very idealistic, really challenging the kind of rule of the Wall Street system. And after that, a lot of those same people got interested in this idea of a sharing economy, got interested and really were forced into this possibility because conventional means of economic life were not necessarily as available to them. So because of doors being shut in their faces around being able to get jobs or have access to owning cars or owning houses, these sorts of things, they turned to the platform economy out of need and also out of some hope. But at the same time, before too long, a lot of those people started realizing, hey, this isn't a real sharing economy. There's something else going on here. And if we're really going to put our economic lives into these kinds of platforms, we need to, first of all, understand how they work, understand what's really going on with these things, and then hopefully have some say in how they operate and some accountability. So this is a moment where people, through a phase of crisis, have been kind of forced to reconfigure their economic lives in different ways in different places, but we're coming to a lot of the same questions wherever we are.
So just kind of building off that, I mean, so would you say a lot of the rethinking of this was coming from a younger generation who was especially hard hit, let's say, in the wake of the Great Recession? And then same way, would you say, as we're starting to move towards this platform cooperativism, it's a kind of a rethink of the coming more from kind of, let's say, the generation, let's say, what people talk about, the millennial generation in their kind of mid-30s to kind of through their 20s. Is that kind of the bulk of the energy around this right now?
Yeah, so there's a funny kind of convergence of the old and the new happening here. I saw a lot of young people being drawn around the world to this idea of a sharing economy, drawn to this new way of doing things. And it is generational, right? Because these are the people who weren't old enough to have gotten kind of bought into the system of home ownership and car ownership and so forth. So and employment. It's not exclusively them. There's a very intergenerational story, but largely what I've seen is a new generation of young folks getting drawn and interested in coming into something like a cooperative movement, something like an arrangement where they might own and govern the platforms they rely on. Though this is interesting because in many ways, a lot of these folks I found weren't aware of the extent of previous generations of the cooperative movement, ways in which previous generations had built producer co-ops for farmers, credit unions for people trying to buy a house, had built the organic food movement on producer co-ops and consumer co-ops, ways in which this cooperative business model has already shaped our world, including our media world through cooperatives like the Associated Press. And so, in the past few years, there's been a process as this new generation has come to a sense of self-awareness of having to recover some understanding of that older tradition and that older legacy, and even that existing sector that is all around them without them noticing, and start to wonder whether and explore whether this form of doing business could actually apply really nicely to the challenges of the online economy. And I think whatever forms it takes, the way in which the cooperative tradition insists on posing those questions of who owns and who governs is really essential for the internet, because those are questions that have been left out, whether you're talking about big corporations or even open source software projects or projects like Wikipedia. In any case, we've been kind of trained to stop asking those questions about who owns and who governs the platforms, and those are precisely the questions we need to ask.
That's fascinating. So you're kind of saying there was an analog era development of these co-ops. Say a little bit more about that, and we have enough time here to kind of step this out a little bit before we get into the modern versions. But for people who wouldn't be that as familiar with that,
yeah,
can you give a kind of a little bit of a background on what was going on in those spaces that are kind of applicable to this resuscitation today?
Take crowdfunding, right? 100 years ago, when people in a community wanted something that they didn't have, and they wanted to pool their money together and produce it, they would form a cooperative, right? My grandfather was born on a farm in Colorado that didn't have electricity, and so like farmers all over the country in the 30s and 40s and 50s, people in his community banded together, put their money together, and formed an electric utility cooperative. They did the same for a lot of their rural production needs and marketing needs and this sort of thing. And as part of that package, they also became owners and had some governance powers over this energy cooperative. And those cooperatives still serve about 75% of the land mass of the United States. So they produced, they were able to build something that was able to last and was able to ensure that rural people in the United States would have access to electricity. And when we look at crowdfunding now, we see a lot of that same spirit, right? People meeting needs by putting their resources together, but we've kind of excised that question of ownership and governance. It's just kind of basically pre-purchasing products. And another example I mentioned before is the Associated Press. That was a media cooperative of newspapers, first in New York City, that had to share some media resources. They had limited bandwidth, essentially, limited access to telegraph lines and to pony, people on horseback carrying news from the Mexican front, right? So they had to pool their resources, even though they were fiercely competitive with each other. And the result was they built a really durable, effective news organization that today, is kind of bucking the trend of media polarization. And this is one media source that Fox News and whoever else can agree on. And that's a really unique, amazing thing. And its capacity to hold that space is the result of its cooperative business model, and it's actually sustained attacks from non-cooperative alternatives over the decades, and has succeeded against them. So these are two very different kinds of cooperative models, but they reflect the way in which we have long-standing traditions of being able to build businesses that are owned and governed by the people or organizations that they serve. And when we look at the online economy, we still have a financing model and a business development model designed for toys. This venture capital toolkit that we have has done amazing things, has enabled rapid growth and innovation in some really wonderful ways. But it's really not that great for serving the kind of utility role that so many platforms have come to play. And this is where I think it's so important to start looking at a wider variety of ownership structures, to enter into that challenge of ownership design and ask ourselves, given what this thing is, who should it be accountable to? Who are the appropriate owners, and how can we create the structures so that those stakeholders can finance and build the platforms that they need?
One thing, you mentioned kind of you didn't really refer directly to worker co-ops, and I know there's a long tradition of that, particularly in Europe. But could you just talk a little bit about the kind of roots in that kind of tradition, which is a little bit different than the two you just gave there?
That's right. You know, there are a range of different kinds of cooperatives, and they're usually classified by their stakeholder model. You know, whether they're owned by their consumers or whether they're owned by businesses or whether they're owned by workers, as you say. And in Europe, it's more common to have larger scale worker cooperatives doing things like manufacturing, social services, this sort of thing. In the United States, worker cooperatives have tended to be quite small through history, but one thing that we do have quite significant scale for is employee stock ownership plans. So there are some quite large companies that have significant employee ownership, companies like Southwest Airlines. Actually, quite a number of tech companies have strong employee ownership plans, stock options, and this sort of thing. So employee ownership is already built into the social contract of the Silicon Valley economy. The problem is actually that doesn't account for the fact that a great deal of labor is going into these platforms from their users, right? Not just the employees, the people who these companies want not to be viewed as employees, like say Uber drivers. And that I think is the more pressing challenge because by far the larger number of people who are depending on these platforms are going to be their users rather than the relatively small number of people directly employed by the company. And so that's a question that we really need to take on. And so user ownership, which can look kind of like consumer ownership in times past, actually now has become a kind of worker ownership. The lines are getting blurred. And actually, when you look at a lot of the new experiments coming up in the platform co-op space, many of them are multi-stakeholder models. So they have different classes of owners. So there are employee owners, but there are also user owners and maybe even founder owners and others, enabling them to balance these different groups rather than choosing one over the other.
Okay, so we've had this tradition of cooperative approaches to organizing the economy or pieces of the economy, and we've had this kind of evolution of the internet. And we've got to this point where they kind of converge. And so talk a little bit more in depth about platform cooperative and how that is a different animal than, or an evolutionary kind of whatever step, I guess, from these two other channels that channel into it.
Well, in around 2014, I started noticing as a reporter that there were a number of companies around the world that were starting to take that idea of a sharing economy seriously, and we're really trying to figure out how to build business models that did sharing all the way down. And this ranges from a good number of startups that were really starting from scratch and really very isolated to also larger platform companies like, one example is Managed by Coop, which is kind of like the Uber for office cleaning, that realized, hey, offering some equity to our user workers is actually a really good business idea because it'll help get them more invested in the platform and help with retention and loyalty, which is such an important challenge for a lot of platforms. These experiments were starting to take shape. Examples like Stocksy United started in 2012, 2013. That's a photography platform, a stock photography platform owned by its photographers as well as its employees. And it was started by people, coming out of the mainstream stock photo industry, knew their market up and down and realized, hey, we're missing a whole segment here. We're not really giving photographers what they need. If we created a company accountable to those photographers, we could get the best photographers in the business. And in that, they were basically just building on the model of an earlier generation, Magnum Photo, a really renowned photography cooperative of a previous time that's still very much alive and well today. So this model is tried and true, and and they applied it to the platform economy, and they've really succeeded. And we saw others who were building gig platforms that would be owned by the gig workers, and data platforms that would be owned by the people feeding data into it, especially with examples like medical data and farmer data, and cases where the control over data becomes really, really important and really valuable. So the challenge was starting to help these people see each other. And so in 2015, with Trevor Schultz, I co-organized a conference in New York, bringing a lot of these people together. And since then, we've just been, we've been organizing our own conferences. Others have been organizing their own. We just had one in Toronto, organized by their National Cooperative Association, just on platform co-ops, and more and more trying to build an ecosystem, and that means building up a culture, where people know how to support and encourage cooperative models. It means building financing streams. What does it look like to finance a cooperative that isn't owned by and controlled by investors, but is owned and controlled by the stakeholders? It means figuring out legal structures. It means thinking about policy as well. Looking at examples like Austin, Texas, where the city drove out Uber and Lyft and encouraged a spree of local alternatives. So it's about building that ecosystem and recognizing that right now the platform economy came out of a certain kind of ecosystem, certain kind of history, certain kind of choices. And if we want a different future of work and a different future of the online economy, if we want just even a wider range of options, we need to think ecosystemically, not just about particular startups or particular unicorns.
So when you say the platform came out of the current well-known or kind of established platform economy came out of a certain ecosystem, that meaning the kind of venture capital based, startup kind of Silicon Valley model. Is that I just want to be clear.
Yeah, and that has to do with a certain set of legal habits, a certain set of financial habits, also cultural habits, like going to Burning Man, right? People in my field in media studies have said a lot about how Burning Man as the cultural event actually reflects certain features of Silicon Valley, the economic engine, right? And so it does require us to think differently about our various roles in the economy. But it's been really exciting over the last couple of years to see that ecosystem start to take shape. To be approached by people who have deep experience in startups and finance, actually recognizing that something's happening here and starting to set up funds that are actually really appropriate for these kinds of startups. And you look at these models, these new innovative models, and they actually kind of look something like the cooperative banks that farmers had to develop for themselves in the 20th century, right? Like the 128 something billion CoBank down the road from me in Denver. That's something, the fact that is there, a bank that is itself a cooperative owned by cooperatives, is not something that a lot of young people today are aware even exists. But to me, that legacy gives me a sense of confidence that that we can build this kind of ecosystem for the online economy today, just as our ancestors were able to build cooperative economies to meet their needs.
So let's explain then a little bit of like a platform cooperative, how that would work in distinction to, again, we've been making allusions, but basically at some level, all the biggest, many tech companies are essentially our platforms. They tend to scale dramatically, and once you get a network effect, it kind of locks it in a way, and there's a lot of reasons to stay in that network. So everything from Facebook, as you mentioned, social media, to, well, even platforms like the iPhone app platform or the, or Google search, everyone wants to go to search. Anyhow, there's all these platforms, and then also it's Uber, it's Airbnb. It's like once there's a place that works for some people and it works, it starts to scale quickly. So there's a lot of powerful reasons why that happened, and there's a lot of reasons why that works. You've made some critiques with it, which I think is healthy, but talk about how your model would work in differentiation from that. I'm just, and kind of walk people through the differences.
Well, I think in some ways, like anything new, it remains to be seen. We have to try things out and see what works, and that's what we're doing now. A few patterns that I can see emerging and that may reproduce themselves further are that actually cooperative models could be better suited to align with the structure of the internet. There's a lot of anxiety right now about in kind of tech circles, right, about how the internet is this decentralized technology that has produced really centralized outcomes. Well, that's not because of the technology; it's because of the ownership structures, right? Because the venture capital injection process requires this output of kind of monopoly scale profits, and in contrast, cooperative models in the past have tended to scale a bit differently. Rather than creating large multinational corporations, cooperatives tend to scale through federation. So they tend to replicate on the local level and then recognize economies of scale among them, and then build umbrella organizations that share those shared costs. And so we might end up seeing a kind of internet in which there are local nodes to offer local services, local needs. Imagine a kind of rather than Uber everywhere, you've got your local taxi or ride sharing co-ops that are sharing software globally with all the other aligned taxi co-ops, right? So you have that blend of local control and economies of scale. And this is something cooperatives have always done really well. Is Home Depot does one size fits all hardware really well, but the only thing keeping local hardware stores afloat, I love local hardware stores, so I'm really grateful for that, is cooperative distribution companies that are owned by those stores, enable them to retain their independence but also achieve economies of scale. And and this could be really useful in a case like social media, right, where we're very concerned about the fact that Facebook has so much of our data because every interaction on Facebook has to go through the central node. Well, there's technology that's known as federated social networks that allows us to have experiences like what we have on Facebook, but to do it through local nodes interacting with each other. Kind of like, how we might be able to email each other despite being on different domains. We communicate over a protocol rather than a shared platform. And there are examples of this like Mastodon, like GNU Social. If you haven't heard of these, don't worry. The reason is that there hasn't been an economy to support these kinds of models. It's not a technological problem. That the problem is a business model. But that kind of federated structure has actually worked really well under cooperative business models for a long time. So that poses the question to me of what technologies are we not really getting the greatest benefit from because we're constrained by the business model. I hear again and again from founders, that they couldn't make decisions they wanted to make, including choosing more federated models because they were constrained by their investment and ownership models. Totally. What choices could we start being able to make if we had cooperative business models behind more of our technological infrastructure?
Okay, so totally get that, and I think you're right. In fact, the constraints, I felt the constraints myself with the startups I've essentially founded. So talk about the voice or the governing differences, because there's a lot of people who think, well, really scaling awesome technology or a platform that's really intuitive and all these things, might take some kind of top-down or kind of Steve Jobsian kind of fanatical vision rather than a kind of a democratic way to kind of figure stuff out. But to talk about that issue of how do you process input from a large number of people to run a cooperative?
Well, first of all, I would just start with Mark Zuckerberg's recent manifesto on global community, right, which he released just a few months ago, and in that he in some sense admits that the top-down approach doesn't work for Facebook, that you can't manage Facebook in a one-size-fits-all top-down way. So he proposes this kind of web of democratic co-governance, he calls it democratic, on the platform to respond to the needs of users in many places and languages and cultures, recognizing that actually local control is the only way to make something like that work. The problem is he's very constrained because his so-called democracy really can never be more than just focus groups, right? It can't build in real accountability, real trust. It's always just about making sure that people feel that they're being listened to in some way, which is not a bad thing, but it's kind of it's kind of a short. He can't go any further than that. And when you look at the span of cooperative business models in the past, you see a tremendous range and a creative range of governance options, right? If you're in a 12-person cooperative house, yeah, you probably want to have a meeting once a week that'll be long and boring or maybe a little too exciting, and hash things out because you're all living together and you all know each other and that sort of thing. That's fine. I've done it. But I'm also a member of a credit union that's the largest mortgage lender in the region. They don't call me up every day or ever to ask me what they want me to do, what I want them to do with my money, or who they should sell a mortgage to. They have managers to take care of that, and I can still go to the annual meeting, vote for a board of directors, have an influence on the general direction of things, while leaving the details to people who for whom that's their job, right? This is not so different from running other kinds of companies. The major difference is that ultimately the accountability is not to investors whose primary interest is profit. The accountability is to people who are participants in the platform, whose primary interest might be economic benefit, but is probably other things as well, like privacy, like good working conditions if they're working, a range of concerns that might come to them, and that gives a cooperative a lot more flexibility to make decisions based on a more complex bottom line. And especially when we're talking about utilities that are balancing different stakeholders, that are kind of managing a marketplace, that kind of multi-stakeholder balance, that kind of direct accountability is quite powerful. And it you could look at the investor ownership model as a kind of inefficiency, right? Because Facebook has to have one face to its investors and say, we're doing everything we can to extract as much data and value from our users as possible. And then another face to its users, which says, we just care about your privacy and your experience, and we give you all these privacy controls, which of course have nothing to do with what the platform sees, only what other people see, right? They have to maintain this kind of two-faced logic about their business, in which they're telling one thing to one group and another thing to another group. Whereas if the users were the owners, they could maybe be much more transparent about here are the things we have to do to make this business work, and here are the things that we promise you, to make sure that we're really respecting your rights. It could simplify the whole logic of building these platforms to have them actually accountable to the people that are using them.
Okay, so there's a voice and a governing thing you explored there. So when you say ownership, talk about the distribution of profit, basically, or essentially the wealth that's generated from that. How does that work in this platform cooperative world?
It could really, if you look at the cooperative legacy so far, we can see a wide range of options, right? Some cooperatives regularly distribute dividends to their members, and that's a big part of the participation, right? Like, in the U.S., REI, the outdoor, retail cooperative, outdoor goods retail cooperative, the members get a kind of dividend on how much they spend each year, and that's a big part of it. In other co-ops, that dividend might be kind of automatically reinvested, and so that might be less a part of the experience. Maybe more of the experience is lower prices. In some cases, we see platform co-ops forming on what looks a little more like a kind of nonprofit model. Some are choosing something that looks more like a model designed to distribute profits to members. It really varies, and it depends on the business you're in. It depends on the kinds of economic alignments and incentive structures you're trying to build to make the business work. And so it could look a lot of different ways. Stocksy United, the photography co-op, does distribute dividends to its members, and that's a major benefit that it offers. And that's something that the photographers really appreciate. On the other hand, there's a group in Switzerland that's developing a medical data cooperative, and they're really anxious about distributing the dividends from the medical research that they conduct responsibly with their members' data, because they don't want to get people into perverse incentive structures where they might end up selling their data irresponsibly when they're desperate for money. So there are a range of models that we see here, and it really just depends on what's appropriate. Governance too can take a wide range of forms, and we're seeing a lot of experimentation in what any of this can look like. A lot of new platforms and tools that are emerging for doing governance at scale among large numbers of people, and I think it's a really exciting moment. Not to say we have a model that you can slap onto your business and solve all your problems, but actually we have a wide range of options for governance and ownership and economic benefit that come out of this cooperative tradition and related traditions that might be actually really powerful for bringing the online economy into maturity.
I like that phrase. Okay, so bringing the online economy into maturity. So because we do see them in this series is and other series as we do there very much is a sense of we're at a juncture that the economy's matured enough. I mean, just to put it this way, the 5 biggest companies in the world now by market capitalization are all tech platforms, whereas even 5 years ago that was not the case. There was only one of them in that category. So there's a kind of relatively new phenomena of the kind of power and growth of these things. So when you look ahead, kind of more strategically, a couple scenarios I was wondering just to explore with you. These platforms are increasingly coming up against backlash or pressure or worry from European regulators, and anyhow, a bunch of ways you can talk about what's going on here. Do you see an evolution where the companies themselves in this space might adopt more? And I'm not literally saying at the commanding heights of the economy, although it could be, but at least down through the kind of ecosystem of current platforms, do you see an evolution going towards more cooperative models, or towards more voice of users, or towards more kind of widely distributed, kind of ownership and distribution of wealth in the kind of the sharing economy platforms? Again, that's one scenario. Or do you actually see, and I'd like to hear that, but then there's other scenarios of like essentially a parallel system that grows in popularity or something. But let's just first look at the first one. Do you see some kind of evolution going on, partly from outside pressure, partly from their own kind of sense of where the world needs to go? What's your thoughts on that?
I think of this as an all of the above strategy.
Okay.
So I work with startups who are trying to adopt these models, but I also was involved, for instance, in submitting a shareholder proposal to Twitter, after it went on sale, that would ask the company to consider to study models for user ownership, recognizing that the Wall Street ownership model was not and is not really working for the platform the way it needs to, and user ownership might be a more sustainable and plausible long-term solution. And it was really exciting to see a lot of great conversation swell up around that. And this is not a very new idea. I mean, a number of years ago when Google was building Google Books, there were some really, I think, important articles by Robert Darnton, the librarian of Harvard University, suggesting that this thing, Google Books, was too important to be controlled by a company like Google. This is a human resource of immeasurable value. And let's figure out a way to fairly transition this, reward the company for its investment, but fairly transition this to an appropriate ownership structure. And I think this is an option that really needs to be considered. And increasingly, we're seeing regulation stepping up. We're seeing the privacy and data regulation in Europe that's going to have an impact on these companies' bottom line. And we're also seeing some kind of fits and starts of discussion about antitrust in the United States. The trouble is with when you're talking about antitrust, pretty much what we have to work with are tools that were created for railroads. And it would be nice to step back and think, what are tools that are appropriate for those kinds of network effects, for this kind of transnational nature of the platform economy? And I would suggest that, if I were talking to you as a CEO of a big platform, would you rather have a patchwork of regulations all over the world, or would you have a simpler regulatory scheme with cooperative ownership and accountability, a kind of democracy within the company, rather than being at the mercy of democracy outside of it? And there's quite a bit of precedent for this. For instance, rural utility companies in the United States are far less regulated than investor-owned utilities, for a reason, because they are recognized, by the government as having their own self-regulatory capacities, and by and large, they practice those. Also, throughout the history of antitrust law, especially for farmer cooperatives, there's been an exemption made for cooperative models, recognizing that an accountable monopoly may be appropriate in cases of a natural monopoly. If you're going to have a monopolistic actor in a field, at least make sure it's democratic and accountable. So at the same time, if you're breaking up these companies, we as users might really lose from the withdrawal of the network effects and the economies of scale. Well, cooperative federation models could be a way of breaking up companies while also retaining certain economies of scale that benefit users and benefit everybody. So I think there's a set of ways in which these kinds of options could be, and actually have been, tools for thinking about monopoly and antitrust, though they really haven't been part of the conversation so far.
Fascinating. So basically, you could imagine, just to sum up a little bit of what you're saying there, you can imagine whether it's through outside pressure of regulation or, frankly, backlash from workers or users even, an evolution of the current models into more cooperative directions, one way. Mm-hmm. It's an interesting way to think about it. Which is kind of where the utilities, if you think utilities, there's a history of how that's happened with formerly totally private sector companies that were so central to what happened that they essentially got driven more into utilities, regulated utilities. That's a model. And then, so let's talk a little bit about the potential of this more of an independent or alternative kind of universe of cooperatives. Again, you talk, it's very nascent, it's early days, there's just really a lot of theories and a lot of experiments, I guess you could think about it. But give us a little sense of where you potential, at least, to see that going in the next 5 or 10 years. Could you imagine a kind of a very robust alternative ecosystem that literally pulls users and workers into that alternative, or
I think so. I think, I think we're going to, as cooperative models have in the past, with a lot of experimentation, start to identify some sectors where this model really works, and there are some real competitive advantages. Where, for instance, that balance of local ownership and economies of scale through federation could just blow the investor-owned models out of the water. That's happened in a series of sectors in the 20th century economy. And and then those can become kind of anchors to help support other projects to form. But already, we're starting to see the kind of ingredients of what we might see here. We're seeing some new financial instruments being developed. We're seeing new cultures and relationships being developed. And one thing that's been really great to see is we're starting to see older cooperative sector actors want to get involved in this and starting to figure out, okay, how could we set up venture funds that are designed for co-ops out of the capital that we're investing anyway. And this is really exciting to see. But as these projects grow and as they develop, they'll feed each other. One of those cooperative principles is cooperation among cooperatives. And this is something that co-ops have in the past tended to do well. When they start to form in one sector, they expand into others, and people start getting the knack of how to run these things, and they see it as a natural way of doing business, and it expands. I don't know how, I can't predict the future. Just as your average venture capitalist doesn't know which 1 out of 10 companies is going to take off, I can't predict which strategy is really going to work. But what's exciting to me is and hopeful to me is that we've got people working around the world on a number of different strategies, trying to figure out which of these is going to work, which among these is going to work, and how we can take those successes and allow them to feed into more. I think, again, it's going to work through ecosystems. It's going to work through setting up the conditions that can support and nourish companies. Another strategy that I think is really exciting is exit to co-op. So for your average startup, there are basically 2 exit strategies that they're going to aim for. One is an IPO on a public market, which is fairly unlikely, but hey, it could happen. And maybe more likely is getting bought up by a bigger company and moving on to your next project. But what if we introduce another strategy in there? Rather than entrepreneurs just grooming themselves for early investors and then either public markets or buyouts from bigger companies, what if entrepreneurs could groom their companies and themselves for exit to co-op, right? So maybe at an early growth stage or a little bit further along, they start to realize that this business is working. It's got a loyal user base, that there's some economic transaction and benefit happening there. And those users would really see an upside from becoming longer term stakeholders in the project, right? You could imagine a kind of mechanism for transitioning the company to user ownership or to a kind of multi-stakeholder model that would end up paying off the founders, getting them, maybe they would retain a role, maybe even retain leadership, but they would get the opportunity to have their risk and their investment rewarded through this buyout, while also ensuring that the future sustainability of the company is going to be on the terms of its true stakeholders rather than essentially an investor class. And this is not an unprecedented idea. Already we have mechanisms in the United States through tax incentives and really a whole industry for employee stock ownership plans, allowing companies, once they've reached a certain size, to transition to an employee reward system through stock ownership. So it's not so far-fetched to imagine putting in place the kind of financing and legal support and kind of process for companies to transition to co-op. And right now, one thing I've been looking for, along with a lawyer partner of mine, is where is that profile in the portfolios of accelerators and early investors of companies that aren't giving them the payout that they need through the kind of conventional exits, but are actually healthy companies, and where a co-op model could actually serve the investors, the accelerators, the founders, all the existing stakeholders, while also having the shared benefit of ensuring that the future growth goes to serve the users and goes to serve the people who really depend on the platform, and could actually spur even more growth than other models might allow.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Actually, I think there's something really compelling there, because really there is such a limit on the exit strategy, and so many things actually go to basically end their lives, not because they weren't workable and they actually weren't providing value, but because they couldn't scale or you couldn't get them sold, basically.
Yeah, and this model allows for a wider range of options for scale. Like, for instance, Stocks United, that photo company, they've decided to scale at a modest pace, right? And their photographers have really driven this. I think the founders and employees would like to see more growth, but the photographers have said, hey, we've got a good deal here. Let's make sure we're not growing too fast. And there's still a viable company. Infinite scale need not be the destination of every company. And it allows for replication. It allows for multiple players in the market. So this is an opportunity to rethink the story that we tell ourselves about what a startup needs to look like, and start admitting the possibility of other kinds of players that might lead to a healthier kind of online economy.
So as we're kind of winding up here, we're doing our own kind of event coming up here, more on policy and what needs to happen from the government side of things, particularly pertaining to the futures of independent workers. Is there anything from that policy realm that would help here? Because we've actually been talking about a situation that potentially could be done even outside of government. But talk about an emerging agenda that would be very beneficial to this movement or this kind of direction of the economy. If what would be needed in a governmental scale or a kind of policy scale?
Well, great. And already platform co-ops are starting to kind of fill in the gaps of policy, and that's always one side of it. For instance, Smart, which is a freelancer co-op in started out of Belgium, is spreading all over Europe and beyond now, has been a process by which freelancers have used the cooperative model to build the social safety net that a freelance lifestyle otherwise wouldn't afford, and meet that gap. But policy can also spur this, and it has in the past. Certainly, with those electric co-ops I've been talking about, policy was an incredibly important player in providing the low-cost financing and support that those co-ops needed. And we see that very much with the platform economy. For instance, we've seen a lot of excitement from policymakers simply because I think they're sick of trying to say no to these platforms that are invading their transportation networks and tourism economies and so forth, providing really great services that people want, but doing it in a way that causes these local jurisdictions to lose control over their own economies. And so platform models can become something that these policymakers can say yes to, finally, an alternative. And already we've seen a lot of interest from, say, the UK Labour Party, from Jeremy Corbyn, from Barcelona, and the city council there, people in Congress in the United States who've been coming to us looking for guidance on this stuff. And so the craving is there. One example is kind of worth considering, and is also a little bit of a cautionary tale, is that in Austin, where the city actually drove out Uber and Lyft and enabled a bunch of local upstarts to fill the space and experiment with different models. They didn't really get enough time before the state government came in and reversed that, and Uber and Lyft came back, and the competitors weren't really ready to play yet. But it just shows how governments can play a role of creating the space for local alternatives to form. But there are a range of other options. One is financing. Recognizing that co-ops are often at a disadvantage in financing, and that basic kind of support for these kinds of co-ops, even on the scale that governments are already providing in tax incentives for investor-owned corporations to come to their areas, even approaching that, would make a big difference. Right now, the U.S. Department of Agriculture's loan program for electric co-ops is revenue positive. It gives these co-ops a benefit, but it actually also results in a profit for the government. So it's not costing people anything. But it recognizes that cooperative models are going to result in keeping more value local, in keeping tax revenues, keeping profits that are generated in communities, keeping them in those communities. And so there are a lot of benefits. So cities like New York, Madison, Wisconsin, Oakland, a bunch of cities around the country have already been investing in worker cooperatives for this reason. But looking to platform models as well is a way of scaling that kind of investment. And so there are a lot of opportunities for this. And we're kind of learning from each other right now to see which models are working and which aren't. But I've been traveling to places like Italy, where cooperatives have developed some really interesting policy innovations. For instance, the government requires them to actually pay a small tax that goes to support the development of other cooperatives. These kinds of policies, recognizing their ability to self-invest, can help support a sector and help it scale in ways that that they might not otherwise, especially when they're dealing with competitors that have structural advantages.
If you had to kind of give people a heads up on where to see the most activity or the most heat in this kind of evolution, kind of as we're winding up here, would you, given that a lot of these tech platforms are rooted in the United States, it's a very kind of that would you expect more of this to happen coming out of Europe and other places that are essentially really kind of at the mercy a little bit more of the platforms, or don't have the same kind of investment in a kind of their own country's kind of indigenous platforms?
Yeah, well, I've learned a lot from the Europeans and also South Americans and others, people in places where they don't have quite such a overgrowth of venture capital as Silicon Valley, right? Where all that money makes it harder for people to think outside of that model. And in Europe, where the funding streams for entrepreneurs are a bit more varied, there's a bit more openness to this kind of creativity. But what's been exciting to me is that we're not seeing all of these projects clustered in any one place. We're seeing them happening transnationally simultaneously. There are even two projects that we're working with, both called Airbnb, in different parts of the world. Both kind of trying to address the same problem and learning from each other as they go. And I think
say more about that. So wait, they're called Airbnb or no? What is
they're called Airbnb.
Oh, Airbnb.
We'll see how long Airbnb lets them keep the name. But it's just an example of how what the kind of growth models that we're seeing are not some particular place generating all the money and all the profits and all the startups and growing from there. What we're tending to see is ideas starting to crop up in lots of places and feeding each other, starting to share software. One of our big hubs is New Zealand, and people are in the U.S. and Europe are using software from New Zealand to build their co-ops. So it's really exciting to me to see that this is not just an opportunity to change how the businesses grow, but to change who gets to build these businesses and create an online economy whose entrepreneurial class is more diverse than what we've seen so far. And and whose benefits are shared more widely.
Well, I think that's a good place to stop. We could keep going, but a fascinating look at the burgeoning world of platform cooperatives, and a lot of interesting insights in the future work for independent workers, and a lot of interesting things potentially on the horizon here. So thanks, Nathan, for coming in with us, and thanks for listening.
Well, I really appreciate your interest in this stuff, and encourage your listeners and watchers to get involved and find their way into this conversation themselves.